Hi, this is Miss Drake here. I'm pretty sure you already know that, but I wanted to talk about ideology and economic policy. I know we went through that really quickly last week, so I wanted to back up and make a little video and insert that into, or try to insert that into our slides through Nearpod, and that way we could also pause from time to time, and I can ask you some questions through the video through Nearpod and check for your understanding, because this can be a little tough. I'm sure we probably pretty much all know that when you look at political ideology, that there are events that will shape policy making, what the Democrats do, what the Republicans do, what third parties do, how they respond to crisis situations. But this slide in particular, it's talking about the economy. And so I wanted to talk about, first of all, government intervention and how much is, and I use that in the quotes, enough. Like the question, how much government involvement is okay in your life? And everybody differs. And the answer really for everybody is enough to protect my rights personally. So let's talk about how government can get involved in the economy. We have to stretch all the way back, however, to 1776, the same year the Declaration was written. And this is where Adam Smith wrote what we typically just summarize as the Wealth of Nations, but there's the entire title on your screen. And he is going to actually coin, use, and really define the word capitalism, free market society. So what he believes is that a nation's economic prosperity can best be supported and achieved through allowing people to freely operate in the market, which is buying and selling. And so basically, if you let producers, businesses, and consumers, purchasers, really organize and operate themselves with as little government interference as possible, you're going to have the best economy. Of course, we have one extreme, that's laissez-faire economy with as little government interference as possible. There's really no such thing as no government interference, because that just really never exists. But you can have really just a little bit of government interference. And then on the other extreme, you can have that command or control economy, like the Soviet Union. So the United States is somewhere in between this. And honestly, we're kind of more towards the middle or laissez-faire. We don't like a lot of government interference. Of course, it depends on the situation, like, for example, during the Great Depression, where the federal government had to get more involved in a crisis event. So the U.S. is a mixed economy where most of the economic decisions are left to those consumers and producers. And so I wanted to stop here and pull up the types of federalism to talk about how that's important to what we're talking about here too. Let's go to that. So this was our presentation on federalism. And so when you look at this, I was really looking to go back to the federal system, the one in the middle, where there's power that flows between the national and state governments. And so we looked at all of these types of powers for sure. But what I wanted to get to was dual and cooperative federalism. So the reason I wanted to talk about that is how we approach economic issues, because some economic issues are going to be better served by the federal government dealing with them, and some economic issues are going to be better served by states dealing with them. And so that's going to bring us into a discussion about dual and cooperative federalism. In dual federalism, that's that layer cake. Okay, dual, that means there's two, and that they are separate. Okay, there's one and two, and that's dual. And so you have the federal government, the state government, they do their own things, and here they are, and they're working, they're working separately, but, they are trying to do some things together, very few, those concurrent powers like taxing. So that's dual federalism. Cooperative federalism is kind of where they work together. So there's still separate entities. There's the states, there's the federal government, or either one, because, I'd hate to make the federal government my middle finger, or state government. Anyway, you pick which one. It doesn't matter. One of them's state, one of them's federal. And so what happens is they kind of blur together. That's the marble cake federalism, where the lines kind of blur together on exactly who does what. And so for looking at this, the powers that sometimes kind of can get blurred, and that's going to be an example like, the Great Depression. And so going on into the 1970s about how the federal government and state governments both will work together to make things happen for our country. The powers really aren't focused on just one level of government, kind of flow to give people and groups more access really to government. So coming back to our slides, let's go to then economic indicators. How healthy is your country? So I'm going to back up one actually. So looking at this, first of all, how much government involvement is enough? There are different levels of government intervention. Laissez-faire being the very least, command being the very most, and America somewhere in between. And federalism plays a large part of that. Are we going to let federal or state governments get involved? Then when you look at, okay, so now we need to figure out who's going to get involved and where. That comes from studying your economy. So basically, where is it sick? How healthy is your economy? That will determine in the United States, because we're capitalistic, how much government involvement is necessary, federal or state government involvement. So one of the things that we use is the gross domestic product. Gross doesn't mean, ew, that's gross. Gross means total. So this is the total measure of goods and services produced by a nation in a year. So when we are studying the gross domestic product, or GDP, and we can also look at what we call per capita GDP, which is the gross domestic product divided by our population, so how much each person basically produces. But for GDP, we define an economic recession, and a lot of students will ask, how do we know we're in a recession? Like, did somebody just make that up? No, we actually look at numbers. And so if there are 2 consecutive quarters, and 1 quarter is 3 months, so if there's a 6-month negative GDP growth, where we are not producing as much as we have been, then we're considered to be in a recession. There are a lot of causes for that. Who gets the blame for that? Of course, everybody points to everybody else, and, it's the president's fault, it's Congress's fault, it's Russia's fault, I don't know. So there's a lot of different reasons that can happen because of that. It could be policies on foreign trade. It could be crisis issues in our country. There's a lot of things that could cause a recession. Usually it's more than just one thing. It's a whole bunch of things that compound together at the same time. But when you look at the gross domestic product, that's a good indicator of the health of your economy. Unemployment rate measures the percentage of people actively looking for a job, but they can't find one. Now, it doesn't include people who just aren't working. So stay-at-home moms, stay-at-home dads, doesn't include, people who just aren't looking for a job. It also doesn't include, people who look for a job for a long time and they're like, I can't find a job, I'm just giving up. It's not that. Really, it's looking for people who are actively looking for employment, but they cannot find a job. And so a high unemployment rate is not good for the country. And sometimes, that could be coupled with a recession, because what's going to happen is people are going to then not be able to find a job to produce. So how is that going to impact the GDP? Negatively, right? Because people aren't producing, and so the GDP may continue to spiral downwards because fewer people are producing things. So if fewer people are producing things, because they're not working, they're also not going to be buying things. So that's going to be problematic as well. Inflation is another indicator of how healthy your economy is. There's always going to be some inflation. We kind of have to deal with how much is okay. So inflation specifically means the rise of goods and services without real increase in wages. So basically the value of that product doesn't increase. It's just the amount that you're paying for that. And there's no direct correlation or rise in wages along with that. So it really does get to be just more expensive. It's not more valuable, Like that hamburger is not more valuable today than it was 10 years ago, but maybe it costs a couple dollars extra and I'm not making a couple dollars extra. That's inflation. And of course that can be bad for the economy because of supply and demand. People just aren't going to spend their money on that kind of thing. So one way that we look at inflation, and I thought this was pretty interesting. The government, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, tracks 80,000 items and produces a monthly report to determine how much those things cost. And that's how they measure inflation. So those 80,000 items, if prices are, going up, the federal government may recommend a cost of living wage increase. So that could happen, say, in Social Security. So if you you've retired, you're receiving your Social Security, there's a set price each month or set wage each month that you get from Social Security. That may have to increase because things are getting more expensive, but you also need that wage increase. So I'm going to click on that website and we'll take a look at it. So this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. And so it tells you all about the Consumer Price Index. And so it explains that to you, the average change over time of the prices paid by, consumers. So when, I scroll down, taking a look at that, October the 13th, the Consumer Price Index for all items rises 0.2% in September as used cars and trucks index increases. And then, of course, you're looking here at consumer prices up 1.4% over the year ending September 2020, especially food prices. A lot of people have commented on that about food prices that are higher, but energy prices have actually declined. I thought that was pretty interesting. So you could also take a look here at the CPI index here for the quarter. So that's 0.2. And so the next release would be November the 12th at 8:30 a.m. So you can set your timer to check back here at this website. Okay, so to summarize what we've got here, the three things that we're looking at are gross domestic product, unemployment rates, and inflation. So if you have a high unemployment rate and high inflation, that's bad. If you have a high gross domestic product, that's good. So if you start mixing these things together, you have a reduction in GDP, high unemployment rate, high inflation. That is not a healthy economy. So you need to figure out what medicines you need to give it. And so in ideology, if you look this way, Republicans are willing to accept higher unemployment rates in order to achieve lower inflation. So, what they're looking at is, Republicans will say, in general, not all of them, but in general, they'll say, listen, we want lower prices because that's actually what's going to fix unemployment, because what's going to happen is if you have lower prices with supply and demand, what's going to happen is people may buy more, maybe, and that actually will in turn eventually help out this unemployment because businesses are going to make more money and they can hire more people. However, Democrats are going to be willing to tolerate inflation to lower the unemployment rate. So the Democrats will say, look, inflation is going to happen. We just need to make sure it's controlled. So what happens is, even if you have higher prices, you want to get the government involved to put people to work. So you want to lower the unemployment rate because then what's going to happen is there's going to be more people who can purchase these things and that the inflation is going to balance out eventually. And so that's just two different approaches that the video earlier was talking about in terms of how to solve these economic issues. Which is worse for a country? They're both bad in terms of unemployment and inflation. They're both bad for a country. But if you try to fix one, it's kind of like squeezing a balloon on one end, then it makes the other end bigger. You squeeze that end, it makes this end bigger. So you go back and forth with, trying to reach this equilibrium where you have at least a stable economy and hopefully one that is going to be growing. And just to show you, clicking on that bottom link on the screen, this is pretty cool. This is concepts looking at employment and unemployment, who's counted as the unemployed or the labor force. So you've got some examples here. Elena reported to the interviewer last week she worked 40 hours as a sales manager. She's employed. Steve lost his job when the local plant of an aircraft manufacturing closed. he's been contacting other businesses to try to find a job. We call that unemployed. And so Linda's a stay-at-home mother. She was occupied with normal household activities. She didn't look for a job. Her 80-year-old father who lives with her has not worked. Linda and her father are not in the labor force. And so the labor force is classified as people who are, employed or looking for a job. So that's unemployed. So right here. Okay, people who aren't employed or unemployed are not part of the labor force. So you would say Linda and her father are really not part of the labor force. But this particular website actually extends a pretty long way. So you're looking at some really good information here that's really specific to our course, because we're just talking about some basic concepts. But if you are a little confused about, what does it mean truly to be unemployed, there are lots of situations here that you could take a look at. Okay, so I'm going to back up one. We've talked about government intervention, where this is going to lie in terms of a little bit, a lot, or just right in the middle, with America being a mixed economy, and how that would work with federal and state governments. And then we've talked about, okay, then we need to figure out how much involvement, like the government involvement being the medicine. Where do we put that government involvement? Do we put in federal? Do we put in state? How much and exactly what medicine do you need to combat these illnesses of recession, unemployment, inflation? And so Republicans and Democrats will have differing views, but they want the same results. They want a happy and healthy economy. So one of the other things that they take a look at is the business cycle. And so the business cycle is where you actually can track economic activity. And that's where you can take that economic activity and you can start using that as a trend, saying, well, in this situation, if you have high inflation, the government did this and it worked. If you had high unemployment, the government did that and it worked. And so you're looking at the history of a repeating pattern of business. It doesn't always mean the same thing is going to work, even though it's a similar situation, because people always react differently. But, you're looking at a history, a track record of credible ideas that might actually work to help figure out and resolve an economic problem. So taking a look at our screen here with the business cycle, policymakers, basically it's people in government, have differing ideas about actually defining an economic problem. So when we look at creating or defining an economic problem that's been created or caused, we sometimes differ in our government about what the problem is, what caused it, and then, of course, how to solve it. So you back up and you take a look at all of the causes that are leading up. It's usually a whole bunch of causes leading up to, the housing crisis. You're looking at 2007, 2008. And so, of course, now we look at our economy and we kind of know that this COVID issue has been a problem. So then how do we solve it? And, of course, you're going to have different policies depending on what political affiliation you have. So the business cycle is going to track the economic activity ups and downs, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. So really quickly going to the business cycle, just to look at the places of demarcation on the business cycle. So what happens is right here you have the peak. So the peak, we're going to start there. The peak is where you have an expansion, you'll see that over here, an expansion of the economy. And then once you'll know you hit that peak when you start this contraction. This is actually called a contraction, not just a recession. And then you can get into a depression here. This line is what we call normal activity. So you can look at over time where our economy has been. And then, of course, is it growing from where it's been normally, or is it contracting or receding? And so what happens is sometimes you will get into a contraction, and then you might not get into that depression, and you'll expand to recover, and then you might hit that peak again. And really, the business cycle is more jagged, looking at the patterns of history. But these are just, of course, the pieces of the business cycle: the peak, the recession or contraction, the expansion, or we also call that sometimes recovery, and then you have this depression or a trough, which of course we rarely have depressions, thankfully, but we will have recessions. Thank you, Investopedia, for the great chart. So we're going to come back a slide and take a look at the business cycle again, and just looking at three main theories on how government action impacts the performance of the economy. We have the Keynesian theory, supply side theory, and monetarism theory. So basically the federal government will step in to influence the economy with monetary and fiscal policy. Those are big words, but they're pretty simple. Monetary policy just means the availability of money. That's where you get the phrase monetary policy. Fiscal is a little more challenging as a word. Fiscal means not physical, but fiscal, taxing and spending, how the government will tax and spend your money. Regardless of whether you're approaching this with making money more available to the public, for people and businesses to utilize, or if you're going to tax people and businesses and then spend that money to fix economic problems, the goals are, lower unemployment, economic growth, and a stable economy. So you can tweak monetary policy, you can tweak fiscal policy as the federal government, but the goals are the same. It's to basically get that healthy economy back on track. So let me go back to, there we go, okay. So let's talk about one of the first theories, and that's Keynesianism. So that's named after John Maynard Keynes. It looks like Keynes, but it's Keynes. He published what's called the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money in 1936. Wow, sounds very interesting. And it's during the Great Depression. That's what's interesting. And really, even though the title might not sound really pretty cool, his ideas were pretty interesting. He's like, look, what's the driving force behind the economy, the business cycle? It's about individuals' decisions. People are going to do one of two things. They're going to save money or they're going to spend money. It's pretty simple, okay? In time periods when the economy is expanding and growing, and isn't this sometimes true? People become overconfident, they overspend. That exacerbates this boom and really is blowing up the economy really quickly. Because it's like, hey, our economy's doing great. Let's go spend some money because we've got money to spend. It's sitting in my pocket. Might as well go out and spend it. But in contractions, people become afraid, and sometimes excessively afraid, where they'll cut back on spending and investing. That exacerbates that contraction. Maybe even to a point of not just a recession, but a depression. And isn't that true when you look at some of the things that are happening in COVID, right? I mean, people become a little scared and they go and impulse buy. So, you can't find toilet paper, or sometimes I couldn't find rice, or just, some of these weird products that, for some reason I couldn't find Fruit Loops for 3 weeks. I don't know. So people will tend to do that. So Keynes is saying people's personal decisions are going to be the driving force behind the business cycle. So what you need to do is you need to counteract what people are doing, or at least counterbalance. So his resolution, he's saying when our economy is sick, what we need to do is to get government involved. And we need to counterbalance a contraction. If the economy is growing and it's prosperous, then that's great. There are things that you can do to kind of slow that growth so it doesn't explode and then collapse. But he's saying we're worried more about contraction. So what he's saying is what a government needs to do is inject more money into the economy. Basically, government spending even over budget. So if there's more money, then there's more spending during this contraction. His focus is on consumer demand. He said if you make sure people have money, then what they're going to do, if you'll notice, his ideas here, he's saying we need to take this fear of the contraction and we need to make people more confident. Not overconfident. You don't want them to overspend, but you want them to start spending. So spending is going to get us out of a contraction. The examples are Roosevelt's New Deal, Obama's public works projects in the recession of 2007 to 2009. This, of course, is an idea supported by Democrats because it's big federal government involvement. That the federal government needs to get involved and inject this money to give people that confidence to spend, and that's going to pull us out of course, a contraction. So the second idea is supply-side economics, and you may have heard this called Reaganomics. And the reason is because Ronald Reagan's really the first to use this effectively. He's going to end stagflation. So stagflation was happening in the kind of around the middle of the 1900s. And so this is going to be the result of high unemployment coupled with high inflation. So what happened is, if you tried to deal with high unemployment, so if you tried to interject or inject money into the economy, that's going to exacerbate inflation. If you try to deal with inflation and restrict the money supply so things won't cost more, that's going to really make the unemployment worse. So, the approaches by Keynes is not going to be necessarily the best way to go. So the resolution of supply-side economics is, of course, to focus on supply, because it's supply side, so not your consumer in terms of supply and demand. What should happen is that if you were to focus on production, the supply side of things, that would lower taxes. He says, lower taxes on individuals and businesses. And this is where I think sometimes that Republicans get the idea or the stigma of only supporting big businesses. Because what Reagan did is he put tax cuts, federal tax cuts, on businesses and individuals. He said the result should be where the producer will pass along the savings to the consumer through price. And some critics call that trickle-down economics because, it's trickling down to the lower people, to the people who are just the consumers. But it actually worked, and it happened. So what the businesses did, because they were saving money on taxes, is that they dropped the prices of their goods. With supply and demand, what happens? When you lower prices, you increase demand. So when you lower prices, you're dealing with effectively inflation. You're reducing inflation. When people are buying more, they're putting money back into that business who can hire people, and that's going to take care of the high unemployment. So it worked. Where several presidents before just weren't able to come up with an idea to deal with that. They would try to deal with unemployment, and that'd make inflation worse, or they would try to deal with inflation, that would make unemployment worse. And so this is where you have Reaganomics in the 1980s, and Trump is trying to do the same thing with the tax cuts in order to get our economy back on track, back to where it's healthy. So this focuses on the business and, of course, is supported by Republicans, because what is happening is it's not really federal government involvement where it's giving money. It's actually focusing on, of course, businesses. And so you're reducing the taxes. It's not the federal government giving you stuff and making you do stuff, in terms of the Democrats with big federal government. This is a big federal tactic, no doubt, but it's focusing on individuals and businesses instead of holistically looking at injecting money into the economy. So thirdly, let's talk about monetarism. So you've got an idea where you're looking at Democrats with Keynesianism, Republicans with supply-side economics. Monetarism is just a concept that it depends on which approach you like the best. Republicans and Democrats both have a different approach to monetarism. Monetarism is that monetary policy and fiscal policy we talked about earlier. What is monetary policy? Monetary policy is how available money is to you, mainly through things like loans. It's more available to you if the price of a loan, which is interest rates, is lower. Fiscal policy is the government's policy of taxing and spending. Okay, so what are the ideological differences that we have? Republicans are going to support budgets that are going to generally increase or maintain military spending and decrease taxes. So, for example, the Bush tax cuts happened in 2001 and 3. You're going to reduce the income tax rate for wealthy Americans and below average incomes. So for the middle class, not a whole lot, but for the top and the bottom, you've got tax cuts. And that's going to, of course, then you're going to increase military spending for Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, the result is a federal deficit of $374 billion in 2003. Now, just to take a look at these two, and I've got a couple of links here you can click on if you'd like to. I'll click on one in just a second. But there's a difference between debt and deficit. So the national or federal debt is accumulated over time. That's not what I'm talking about here in terms of deficit. Deficit is overspending of the yearly budget, which eventually is going to be transferred over possibly into debt if you don't make up for that. So, you can click on the debt clock there. That's always interesting to see. The national debt, that's hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions, $27 trillion. So there you go. And you can take a look at, if you were going to pay it off, that's always, how the fun thing. Per citizen, you'd only have to pay around $82,000 per citizen, which, interesting. So anyway, going back to the ideological differences of monetarism. So Republicans are going to say, hey, let's increase military spending and decrease taxes, and that's going to be good for our economy. It's going to keep us healthy and safe, because the main purpose of government is to protect your rights, and there are a lot of threats that are out there in the world. And then we're going to decrease taxes, federal taxes. So where do we get money to pay for things from? Well, that's why Republicans believe that states should be a little more involved. Democrats, on the other hand, would support tax increases on the wealthier Americans, of course, focusing on the middle class, either maintaining that level or maybe reducing that level, and then government spending programs to basically, the phrase is redistribute the wealth. But you're looking at bearing the burden, people who, according to Democrats, can bear the burden at a greater increase. And an example would be Obama's tax increases, almost 5% increase in spending, like Social Security. And so that's going to help give an opportunity for those who might not be as successful to achieve their goals. And the result of that was a federal deficit of $548 billion in 2016. So again, the deficit is overspending of the budget. And of course, Republicans and Democrats are going to have differences about that. Okay, so wrapping up monetarism, in this monetary theory where you have the availability of money, which is monetary policy, with taxing and spending, the primary driving force behind our economy or the business cycle is the supply of money. How much money is readily available to consumers and businesses? So that's like credit, for example, to people and businesses who want to borrow money, who want to start a business, who want to make big ticket purchases like cars and houses and things. So the focus is trying to match the access to money with the growth and productivity. So for people who are monetarists, they think that this is going to help to deal with those three key issues of GDP, unemployment, and inflation, that it would resolve all three of those, because if our economy is growing, then what you need to start doing is watching how much money is available. So you don't want to have this inflation happening, so you start curbing just a little bit. You start curbing the amount of money that's in the economy. And you do that by raising the interest rates to try to slow people's roll, so to speak. So, you spend in because, there's really low interest rates on loans. So you're buying a house and you're buying a car, and you can buy, more of a house, so to speak, when you look at interest rates. So, your monthly payment for a $200,000 house would be higher if your interest rate is 10% versus if it's 3%. So if you want to start curbing what's going on in the economy, you start inching up that interest rate. You don't do it quickly, but you start inching it up. If you want people to spend more to help that unemployment issue, then what you're going to do is you're going to start creeping that back down. You're going to creep the interest rates back down. And that's going to deal with the access to money. Now, you have to be careful because, if you do one or the other, raising or decreasing the interest rate, it could cause a problem. It could lead to inflation, some people say. It could be pretty bad if you're looking at places like Germany after World War I, where you're literally taking wheelbarrows of money to buy groceries. So you do have to be careful, and that's why we have government organizations that regulate that. Hey, speaking of government regulations, let's talk about the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is our country's bank, our national bank. So just a quick history of the bank, by the way. When our country was first founded, the U.S. Constitution was first founded, we did not have a bank. We didn't have a national bank. It wasn't in the Constitution. Nothing in the Constitution says, oh, and the federal government's going to regulate the bank. So how did they do that? Through the necessary and proper clause, implied powers, or the elastic clause, if you will, where it's stretchy. So what happens is we have the first Bank of the United States, which was established in 1791, and it lasted for 20 years. So in 1811, when it expired, the Congress just didn't re-up the charter, and they said, let's give it 20 years, see how it goes. And so it helped to deal with the American Revolution war debt. But then after the War of 1812, we realized, you know what, we probably need another bank. So we created the second Bank of the United States in the 1820s. But the problem was that Andrew Jackson did not like that whatsoever. And so he said, if I'm elected for my second term, I'm going to destroy that national bank and put all the national bank money into state banks, because states are more important than the federal government, unless it's something I want to do, and then it's important. And so what's going to happen is he's going to destroy the second Bank of the United States in the 1830s. Then we don't have a national bank until the 1900s. Woodrow Wilson is going to champion the creation of the Federal Reserve System. So this is called the Fed, not the Feds like the FBI, but the Fed. And so it's controlled by a 7-member panel of governors that are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Thank you, checks and balances. And there's 12 regional banks across 12 districts in our country. There's 6,000 member banks. And it's, even though it's part of the executive branch, it's independent. So they don't answer directly to the president. And what their goal is to really curb inflation. So they're looking at trying to regulate inflation. So they set monetary policy. So they regulate how much money is available in the economy. You know, if more money is pumped out into the economy, what's going to happen is businesses are going to say, we know more money's out there, so we're going to charge higher prices. So the Fed is going to control the availability of money by making it what we call in civics and economics tighter or looser money. And we'll talk about those. Okay, so what happens is that with tight money, you're restricting it. So it's going to be tight, like a tightwad, like you can't buy stuff. And so the government is going to start restricting the money supply to the public. So borrowing money is going to be more difficult, basically because the cost of a loan is going to be higher. It's based on supply and demand. If the cost of a loan, that interest rate, is too high, people are going to say, I don't want to borrow so much money because I have to pay interest back to the bank. And all interest is just what the bank charges for a service. They're going to loan you the money that you ain't got. And so if you want to buy a house and it's $200,000, you probably don't have that in your pocket. I know I don't. But if I did, it'd probably all be in pennies, to be honest. So what's going to happen is that, government is going to say, we want to stop rising inflation. So prices are actually increasing, and so we want to stop prices from increasing. So what we need to do is we need to curb the amount of money that's available in the economy. On the other hand, let's say, for example, we're headed to a recession, or we're in a recession. So the government wants you to spend more money that way. So what they're going to do is they're going to use the ideas of supply and demand, the law of supply and demand. If that price is lower, demand will probably go up. And so, for example, when I wanted to build a house, my husband and I got a loan. And so we were able to actually build more of a house with the money that we borrowed because we knew how much we could afford with the monthly payment. So that would tell us with their interest, how much we could actually spend. And so if the government wants you to spend, the interest rates are going to be lower. So when we're in a recession, for young people who are able to find a job, it actually might not be such a bad thing because, it helps you with things like loans for houses, for college, for vehicles, but it doesn't help you if you want to save. Because, of course, interest rates are lower on savings accounts as well. Okay, this is fun. It's not so bad. I mean, I think the words kind of throw me off here on this slide, but it is interesting about how the government controls the money supply. The first way is the main way that they'll do it. So the Federal Reserve conducts open market operations. So the Federal Reserve, will buy government bonds in order to loosen the money supply. So how exactly does that work, and what does it mean? So what happens is the Federal Reserve will purchase bonds. Bonds are basically loans to the government. Like you can purchase a bond, and so what would happen is you give the government, say, $25, and the government will give you a little piece of paper that says, in 10 years I'm going to give you $25 plus interest rate. So you'll get $30 instead of $25 back by letting the government borrow that money. So the Fed will buy bonds. So what that means is it loosens the money supply. So the federal government will say, the Federal Reserve will say to the government, give us those pieces of paper, those bonds, and we'll give you the money. We're going to buy them from you. So you give us the paper bonds, we'll give you the money. And that puts the money supply out in the economy. Okay? Or if the Fed wants to tighten the money supply, so kind of reduce how much is out there, they'll sell those bonds. And so what they'll do is they will say, okay, we've got all these pieces of paper, these bonds, we're going to collect that money. We're going to actually sell them. We're going to sell these bonds. We're going to put these bonds back to the government, and we're going to, take our money back. And so we're going to hold that because people are spending too much money. And so the open market operations is the main way to control the money supply, is basically buying and selling bonds. So they're going to use bonds to either put money out or bring money back in from the economy. The reserve requirement is another way that sometimes will happen. Basically, this is how much money, deposit money, banks have to hold at the central bank. So that means they have to hold on to that money. Banks can't loan it out. And that's how banks make a profit, is that they will charge interest rates on loans, so they're not able to do that. So if they're not able to do that, then of course they're going to increase the amount of interest that they're going to charge. So increasing that reserve requirement is going to tighten the money supply. The bank is going to say, no, we have to reserve this money. You can't have it, and you have to pay more in interest rates for the money we're willing to loan you. But if you decrease the reserve requirement, if the Fed says, okay, banks, instead of keeping a huge amount of money on reserve, you can actually start loaning it out, then that's going to increase the money supply and interest rates are going to be lower. Then we'll talk about the discount rate. Okay, fun times, discount rate. So basically this is the interest rate that's charged to banks if they borrow money from the Fed. And banks may have to do that. They may have to get more money from the Fed if they need money to loan out. Because again, that's how banks make a profit, is they charge interest on loans. So if you increase the discount rate, if the Fed says you want to borrow money from us so you can operate and make more money, you're going to have to pay more interest to us. That's going to tighten the money supply. That increases interest rates. Decreasing the discount rate loosens the money supply. The Fed says, okay, you could borrow it instead of 10%, 3%. And so that's going to make the money that is available to banks to loan out greater. And so there's going to be more money to loan out, therefore loosening the money supply. In sum, basically it's all about interest rates. So if interest rates are high, that's a sign that the government is trying to do something. If the interest rates are high, what are they trying to do? Combat inflation or deflation? I'm sorry. Let me try that again. If the interest rates are high, is the government trying to combat inflation or recession? I'll get the words right in a minute. So if the interest rates are high, they're actually trying to combat inflation. They're saying, whoa, you people are spending too much money. Let's curb that. If the interest rates are low, that's a sign that we're in a recession, that they want people spending money and not saving it. Get out there and spend some money. So now you can go tell your folks that you need some money to spend in the economy so that it'll help us get out of a recession. I hope that works for you. And I've been talking for 45 minutes, so you're probably bored out of your gourd by now. I hope not. Really, when we go back through this really quickly, I know we've talked about it already. So going back to, again, quick review. First of all, how much government involvement are you going to have in your economy? That's determined specifically by how healthy your economy is. If your economy is healthy and your government's getting involved in the economy, you need to check it, okay, as a citizen, because you want enough government involvement to keep it healthy, but not get the government so involved that it actually becomes problematic. So we watch the business cycle, and then based on the business cycle, of course, You can either do the Keynesian theory, which is going to be basically where you're injecting money into the economy, where you're trying to give people jobs to earn money so they could slow a contraction. And you could do supply side economics, which is favored by Republicans. And so that's where you're giving tax cuts to big businesses so that eventually those businesses can trickle down that savings to the consumer for prices, and that should get us out of a contraction. Monetarism, it depends on your approach, but you have to deal with monetary policy, how available money is, for taxing and spending. And so when you look at monetarism, here we go, the Fed is going to set monetary policy. How available is money to people in the economy? And so if you tighten that money supply, whatever way you do it, if you tighten that money supply, basically what is happening is that interest rates are going to go up and it's going to fight inflation. If you want people to spend more money, then what you're going to do is you're going to make the amount of money available looser, which means you're going to decrease interest rates and hopefully get people to spend. And that's all based on the law of supply and demand. So I hope this helps, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get back together next week. Probably most of our discussion will be about the election results. So I'll see you then.